I read Marcel Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, when I was about 42, and I've always been glad that I didn't try before. It took me 2 years to read it in French, and it's the single greatest influence of what I have been trying to do. The pages I'm going to read are the last pages that he wrote. He had come to the end of his enormous enterprise, which we know today as À la recherche du temps perdu. He was dying. He was writing and correcting against the clock. But the words he was writing, he had conceived long ago. He knew them at the beginning of his 4,000 pages. It was as if someone had designed a cathedral and in his mind had started with the tip of the tower. He wanted to write about time. He knew all these years where he was going. He was writing about his own life, about the people he met in the aristocratic circles of his youth, but in reality, he would write a philosophy, a meditation on time and memory. What he was going to say was about this, that we, with our physical person, occupy very little place in space, but that, with the memories not only of our own past, but also of the past of mankind, reaching back to the earliest history, to the finest and first pages written down by men in antiquity, we stand on top of an immense building made by personal and collective memory, and that this way we occupy so much more space in time that it makes us into giants. This idea of death installed itself in me definitely as love does. Not that I love death, I hated it. But I dare say I had thought of it from time to time as one does of a woman one does not yet love. And now the thought of it adhered to the deepest layer of my brain so thoroughly that I could not think of anything without its first traversing the dead zone. And even if I thought of nothing and remained quite still, the idea of death kept me company as incessantly as the idea of myself. I do not think that the day when I became moribund, it was the accompanying factors such as the impossibility of going downstairs, of remembering a name, of getting up, which had by unconscious reasoning given me the idea that I was already all but dead, but rather that it had all come together, that the great mirror of the spirit reflected a new reality. And yet, I did not see how I could pass straight from my present ills to death without some warning. But then I thought of others and how people die every day without it seeming strange to us that there should be no hiatus between their illness and their death. I thought even that it was only because I saw them from the inside, far more than through deceitful hope, that certain ailments did not seem to me necessarily fatal, taken one at a time. Although I thought I was going to die, just like those who, certain that their time has come, are nevertheless easily persuaded that their not being able to pronounce certain words has nothing to do with apoplexy or heart failure, but is due to the tongue being tired, to a nerve condition akin to stammering, owing to the exhaustion consequent on indigestion. In my case, it was not the farewell of a dying man to his wife that I had to write. It was something longer and addressed to more than one person, long to write. At best, I might attempt to sleep during the day. If I worked, it would only be at night, but it would need many nights, perhaps 100, perhaps 1,000. And I should be harassed by the anxiety of not knowing whether the master of my destiny, less indulgent than the Sultan Shahriar, would, some morning when I stopped work, grant a reprieve until the next evening. Not that I had the ambition to reproduce in any fashion the 1001 Nights, any more than the Mémoires de Saint-Simon, they too written by night, nor any of the books I had so much loved and which, superstitiously attached to them in my childish simplicity as I was to my later loves, I could not, without horror, imagine different from what they were. As Elstir said of Chardin, one can only recreate what one loves by repudiating it. Doubtless my books, like my fleshly being, would someday die. But one must resign oneself to death. One accepts the thought that one will die in 10 years and one's books in 100. Eternal duration is no more promised to works than to man. It might perhaps be a book as long as the 1001 Nights, but very different. It is true that when one loves a work, one would like to do something like it, but one must sacrifice one's temporal love and not think of one's taste, but of a truth which does not ask what our preferences are and forbids us to think of them. And it is only by obeying truth that one may someday encounter what one has abandoned. And having forgotten the Arabian Nights or the Mémoires de Saint-Simon, have written their counterpart in another period. But did I still have time? Was it not too late? I had a feeling of intense fatigue when I realized that all this span of time had not only been lived, thought, secreted by me uninterruptedly, that it was my life, that it was myself, but more still, because I had at every moment to keep it attached to myself, that it bore me up, that I was poised on its dizzy summit, that I could not move without taking it with me. The day on which I heard the distant, faraway sound of the bell in the Combray garden was a landmark in that enormous dimension which I did not know I possessed. I was giddy at seeing so many years below and in me as though I were miles high. I now understood why the Duc de Guermantes, whom I admired when he was seated because he has aged so little, although he had so many more years under him than I, had tottered when he got up and wanted to stand erect, like those old archbishops surrounded by acolytes whose only solid part is their metal cross, and had moved, trembling like a leaf, on the hardly approachable summit of his 83 years, as though men were perched upon living stills which keep on growing, reaching the height of church towers, until walking becomes difficult and dangerous. At last, they fall. I was terrified that my own were already so high beneath me, and I did not think I was strong enough to retain for long a past that went back so far, and that I bore within me so painfully. If at least time enough were allotted to me to accomplish my work, I would not fail to mark it with the seal of time, the idea of which imposed itself upon me with so much force today, and I would therein describe men, if need be, as monsters, occupying a place in time infinitely more important than the restricted one reserved for them in space. A place, on the contrary, prolonged immeasurably, since simultaneously touching widely separated years and the distant periods they have lived through, between which so many days have ranged themselves. They stand like giants immersed in time. Thank you.